that an Asian person feels, or that really anyone of color feels when they feel that their reality has been gaslit by the dominant culture, you know, and it's all the kind of emotional effects that you may experience that don't really appear in like Hollywood movies or bestsellers or anything like that. You know, it's an example I like to give from my book is there's a scene where I am in like where I'm like 7 or 8 years old, and my mother, who didn't know anything about Playboy, put me in a Playboy t-shirt because it was just a bunny rabbit, and then she sent me off to school, and then I was there and no one would tell me what the bunny meant, and therefore I was feeling like there was something really wrong with me, but no one would tell me what was wrong with me. So I would just have this kind of mix of confusion and shame. Like there was a scarlet letter on me, but I didn't even know what that scarlet letter was or what that possibly meant. So that's like one example, but I think we all, you know, I'm sure we all have examples as well. I think that's another defining characteristic for Asians is shame, right?
Yeah, no, totally. Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
There's usually an auntie that delivers that directly to me if I'm not delivering it myself. Kevin, when in the beginning of your book, I would say sort of an incredible sort of inciting incident that happens. And I wanted to know the things that Luke does in the moment are amazing, and he's acting on some major and also some minor feelings. Can you tell us a little bit about what's happening for him in that moment?
Yeah, my book, which is like a novel, so I just want to separate myself from the character as much as possible, which is a thing I'm learning to do, that I have to like remind people that I'm not the character in my book. Yeah, I mean, he's just sort of his arc in the book, but what a lot of it is happening at the beginning is he's a Vietnamese Chinese American man. He's in his early 20s, and he's spent most of his life feeling sort of powerless. And you know, he's actually like okay with it. Like he sort of rolls with it. And basically, like as the book goes, like he lives in this world that has told him that he's powerless. And as the book goes, he's actually like accumulating forms of power, like through work, through relationships, just getting older and a little smarter. And he just doesn't realize the power he's accumulating. And so he kind of just acts like a complete dumb fuck for the entirety of the book. Because he thinks he can just do that because like he can't hurt anyone, he's powerless. So that's kind of like the energy that he's harnessing or lacking.
Yeah, and I feel like for me, in both my books, so I've written one fiction and one nonfiction, and I feel like for both of those books, there was a different moment where I kind of understood that there was a seed, like an idea that had suddenly catalyzed into a book, right? Like there's the writing that you do. We're all writers, so we're writing all the time, and there's a million different things that you write, and some of them get published, and many of them live in weird drawers and in our sad dreams for the rest of our lives. But there's the thing that sort of formulates into a book. Do you guys know, if I were to ask you what that seed was in your book, would you know what that was, Kevin?
My answer to this is, so I don't have like a distinct moment necessarily. Well, I do, but I started writing the book on the subway. And I don't know if you remember, there were these series of ads on the Brooklyn subway or the New York subway for Venmo. And they were all like, there was like this kind of dumpy Asian man in the photo, and it just said like, Lucas buys a drink, or like, Lucas goes to dinner. And like, there were ads for Venmo. And they were completely inexplicable to anyone that didn't already know what Venmo was. And this was 5 years ago. And I just remember like being on the subway, and I just had my phone out, and I was like, I wonder what the rich interior life of Venmo Lucas is like. And I just like started writing that into one note in my notes app on my iPhone.
Yeah.
And like this became this thing where like I just kept adding to it, and like it wasn't supposed to be anything, and I'd never really meaningfully written fiction. And then the note got so long the app crashed. I copied everything from the note into a Google Doc, and it turns out I'd written 20,000 words, which is like about a quarter of a novel.
Words.
Yeah, and at first I was like, oh my God, like I have wasted this much time writing garbage, and then I read through it a bit and I was like, oh, there's something here. So I think that was the moment after the horror of copy pasting something from notes into a Google Doc.
Yeah, fair enough. Cathy, what about you?
Oh God, there's so many seeds. I have like a garden of seeds. I would say, the inception, the very first idea or flicker of an idea or light bulb moment I actually write about in Minor Feelings, which was when I was depressed and I saw Richard Pryor stand up in full for the first time. And then I was like, I want to be as honest about the Asian American condition as what Richard Pryor is doing. Of course, I came nowhere near the profaneness and honesty and anything that he has, but he was definitely an inspiration in that way. But it took me a long time to get to that point, to realize this is a book of essays. And I mean, that because when I saw Richard Pryor, it was like 2011, like an ungodly amount of time ago. And it was started as, then it like turned into poetry, and then it turned into poetry, and then it turned into fiction. And then somehow I landed upon essays. And the first essay that I wrote actually never ended up in Minor Feelings, which was an essay about pornography. And it was like, yeah, it was like I was pregnant and I developed a porn habit. And so I was like, so I thought I would write an essay about watching porn while I was pregnant, but it was a terrible essay. It just didn't end up in the book. But that was another seed, I guess you could call it that. It was a failed endeavor that I am glad is not in it. That's not there.
We need Minor Feelings B-sides.
I know. It's seriously, that is the X. Sorry, I couldn't.
I think a lot of people, by the way, in the chat also need this piece. So just if you decide that this is something else you need to do now and revisit that piece, we're all ready for it.
Oh God, no, I don't want to go back in that rabbit hole, please.
And this happens a lot actually when I'm touring too. People will say to me, oh, you wrote so honestly about what we do and how we do it. I'm thinking specifically when I wrote about colorism in my last book, a lot of to me, and they were really kind of upset with me, where their reaction was actually, listen, there are so many reasons, like white people are so racist to us anyway. Why give them the excuse? Why say that we also are this way? Why do that? You're giving them a reason to do this. And I think, there are two things that I think about that. One is that I don't think I'm giving anybody a reason to anything. I think they've found those reasons on their own. But I do have a lot of sympathy, part of me, for this feeling of why talk about these things that are shameful for us? Why come out with them? Why write about them? Why? And I think both of you do that in ways in your writing. So do you kind of grapple with that yourselves?
Yeah, I mean, actually, that was on my mind because I was thinking I'm so excited to be on this panel with both of you guys. And part of the reason why I loved New Waves and Good Talk is that they're both there's something really, your books are so real and relatable and honest. And I hear that term a lot, right? Relatable. And I was like, what are the ingredients for a book, especially a book about the Asian American experience, that makes it relatable? Now, I mean, that's like a kind of very cliched word that gets thrown around a lot. I've heard that, and with much gratitude, I've heard that about my book as well. And it's like, and I've said it's like part of it is because I don't want to pander to the white audience, which a lot of writers have also said, but I think it's not just that. It's also not pandering to your families and pandering to your culture, because—
Sorry, what?
Huh? Yeah.
Families, is that, did you, I feel like you need to have a t-shirt.
Yeah, don't pander to your families,
Well, it's funny, like a lot of, I think this was happening more like a few years ago, but there was just a lot of literature I was reading by people of color, of course, published by white people. And a lot of it was good, but like in these books, like racism was like usually one of two things, if not both. Like it was a force that was killing people, which is valid. Racism does kill people. But that's not the only thing it does. And the second thing is racism is always used as a plot device rather than like a texture of life.
Yeah,
and that
exactly.
is something that panders, I think, to white people because they want racism explained to them. They don't want it as like a reality that you just have to swim in that pool all day long. And I'm not trying to be bleak. It's not like things won't get better. I actually do think things will get better, but like, it's not going away. We don't just solve it, you know?
Yeah.
Right. It's not something that you can kind of get over through a series of ingenious moves made by an antagonist, right?
Yeah.
It's like the white gaze, you know?
It's like using racism as a plot device for individual growth, you know, rather than whereas racism as kind of this like everyday experience that's much more internalized, it's much more psychological, and you know, and you see it everywhere, not just in novels and everything. Like a lot of white people can only understand racism as this like incident, you know, it's like a series of incidents, which are not that we have to talk about it now, but I mean, it's actually happening now. There've been a lot of incidents, and now, so it's the only way to get like, you know, media cameras to train on any kind of structural hate or structural oppression is like, oh, it's like, since if it's sensationalized in some way.
So we kind of thing happened today, which I know was a question that came up in the other space before we crashed it, which was the Andrew Yang, I'm going to read you guys a little bit from his op-ed piece.
I'm going to get more wine, but just read.
Yeah, okay. We Asian Americans need to embrace and show our Americanness in ways we never have before. We need to step up, help our neighbors, donate gear, vote, wear red, white, and blue, volunteer, fund organizations, and do everything in our power to accelerate the end of this crisis. We should show that without a shadow of a doubt, we are Americans who will do our part for our country in this time of need. Demonstrate that we are part of the solution. We are not the virus, but we can be part of the cure. I mean, I had so many really deep 9/11 feelings when I was reading that, just remembering what that moment was like for that looked like me. And I was filled with all sorts of rage when I read that, but I'm curious, what did you guys take from that?
Kevin, you want to start that?
Well, I just didn't realize until now that racism was our fault. So,
yeah, I know.
So much. It's funny. I've never really. I like, you know, some of Andrew Yang's like platform stuff when he's running for president, like universal basic income is like, I think, a good idea. Like, just something about him never like clicked for me, and I realized he kind of reminded me of a type of like Asian American that I know and kind of used to be, where like, here's like an Asian American man who has largely been in white spaces most of his life, and has largely not thought of himself as Asian. And then I grew up in the suburbs of Massachusetts, mostly surrounded by white people. So like, I was probably that person, but then I became like a fucking adult, and didn't run for president and didn't write shitty op-eds for the Washington Post. So that's my take on that.
Andrew Yang is in such the sunken place, and I don't want to know, how can we pull Andrew Yang out of that sunken place? I don't know. But I think, I don't know, I just find him, that I found that op-ed to be so embarrassing, and I find it very frustrating that he's our sort of most, at this moment, our most visible spokesperson. But you know, I think it also comes from, you know, I know it comes from a place where of good, you know, it's not like he's, it's not, it doesn't seem like it's necessarily a cynical marketing, you know, move. At the same time, I just wish he would take a class on, you know, race politics or something like that. This is what Asian Americans have been, you know, inculcated to think from since we've been here, which is, and I think when he means American, he means white, you know, because it's not, you know, when we're talking, he's like, we need to try harder to be American. He's not saying, He's not talking about Latin Americans, Latinx who've been here for many, many generations. He's not talking about being more like African Americans who've been here for many generations. He's talking about like, we need to be more like white Americans. And so that's how I read it, as a code word for white. And this is, I mean, first of all, it's a stereotype that Asians are always aspiring or trying to be white, but it's also been a carrot that's been dangled in front of us again and again. And I write about this in my book, you know, where someone said to me, actually said to my face that Asians are next, and he was probably talking about East Asians and South Asians possibly, but he probably wasn't thinking about like all the working class Cambodians, for instance, you know, are next in line to be white. And that carrot has been dangled in front of us. And it's like we have used, and that's why the Asian Americans have lived as conditional experience. And he's totally buying into that. He's like, as long as we work hard and we're diligent and we try hard, one day we will become Americans. And we got to just like, we have to just, it's the kind of colonized mindset that we need to stop thinking of. We have to think of it as more of a structural white supremacist problem that where we need to join up with other people of color to try to dismantle. And there's also a lot of work. I mean, I wish instead Andrew Yang, instead of talking about like, we need to be more like Americans, I think there's also a lot of conflicts happening right now. There's a lot of varied conflicts between Asian Americans and other people of color. Like that's something we need to talk about. Not let's belong. We need to be part of mainstream America, which is white, you know?
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, I want to talk about that because like there is a thing that is happening where there is like this sort of false assumption of proximity to whiteness among Asian Americans. And I think the people that believe it the most are Asian. And that is like a really hard thing for me to reckon with. Like my parents have like kind of succumbed to it. You know, like there's a reason like my name is Kevin. Like my parents don't call me Kevin. Like I have a Vietnamese name, you know? So they literally have like a white version of me that goes out in the world, right? And I just think that like there are people, you know, it's not just Andrew Yang, but like I can sort of see like if you get that close to whiteness and you feel like you're a part of it, and it's, you know, Andrew Yang's had like a very privileged life. He's made a lot of money. You know, he doesn't have the same experience as a lot of us. And it just like, I think he's just like let that thing take over all of him, you know?
Yeah.
I think also, I mean, I think so much for me is trying to interrupt that idea right now. I feel like this is a special amount of urgency around interrupting that idea, but it's been so bred into us for so long that kind of staging that kind of intervention is hard for me. What do you guys do to do that? So I'm talking about how do we talk to our own right now? Like, how do you talk to your own about this? How do you talk to that uncle when you go, you know, home who's, you know, the Trump voter? Like, oh, we've got them all in our families, right? I've got them in my family. I don't know.
My whole extended family.
Yeah. And it's horrifying for me on multiple levels, but you know, I feel like it's absolutely necessary to interrupt it. Do you guys feel that way, or do you move on with your life? What do you do?
With our own families and like relatives that we know. I don't know. I'm always ranting at my family and actually at my mother and father. And I have to say, people are complex, you know? So for even, you know, my dad, for instance, was at one point Republican. Now he's more of it, but then he voted for Obama and he hates Trump. But he's, you know, he's both conservative, but also very liberal minded as well. I don't know. I think he's actually more racially aware than the typical middle-aged, I mean, you know, 70-something Korean man, you know. But it is indeed, it's hard. I mean, I just try to get them to talk about their own lives and be like, look, your life is so similar to what's happening to, you know, because they can be racist too. They're really, they would go to a neighborhood and be like, oh, this is a Black neighborhood. And, you know, anytime they would say that, I would say, well, what do you mean by that? What is your, you know, but at the same time, even though my dad would say something like that, he would also say, I don't like the way America treats Black people, you know. But I persist. I mean, it's an ongoing conversation. It's always very hard. I think no matter what race you are, it's very hard to bring it home to your family and try to convince your family. It's much easier to do it in a classroom or talking, kvetching with your friends.
Right, and your students. What about you, Kevin?
Yeah, I don't want to like talk too much in broad swaths, but you know, like there are over 1 million Vietnamese Americans in the U.S. and like the majority of them are first and second gen, right? Unlike, you know, a lot of the other Asian American communities, like we all like, you know, there's no like 5th generation Vietnamese American, or like there's like one maybe. So in a lot of ways, like a lot of people came between 1975 and like 1994. And so in some ways, you know, like the second generation is like the kids are the ones that like kind of yell at the parents. You know, actually I would say my parents are pretty cool. They've always been like pretty liberal. You know, my extended family like feels differently, but they just, more than anything, they just have this survival mentality, and like they only think about their family, right? So like socially conservative stuff, like, you know, like I have grandparents, like they don't really get gay marriage, but like they don't fuck, like they're not gonna mess with it, right? Because it just doesn't belong to them, it's somewhere else. But when it comes to like any policy, just like they only think about how it directly affects them. And what's also really interesting is sometimes like some members of my family are like weirdly anti-immigrant, which is pretty weird because it's like they're either, you know, first generation immigrants or their parents are. But I kind of get where they're coming from, and to Cathy's point, you know, everyone's human and you kind of have to meet them on their level. But like, you know, I live in Brooklyn and I walk around with friends, and like there's always a friend that just like looks at a nice restaurant and is just like, ugh, gentrification, you know? And I'm just like, who do you think gentrifiers are? Like, I'm a gentrifier. I'm not from Brooklyn, you know, even though I'm not white. And it's just so funny because it's like everyone thinks gentrification is like the thing that happens after they've arrived, you know, like they're just closing the door behind them. And like, the more I think about that, the more I like realize like that's kind of where my family's brain is at. It's not so much rational as it is like emotional.
Sure. I mean, also I appreciate that when you started this, when we were talking about Andrew Yang's piece, you're like, I used to be that guy. And I feel like that's that connection, that kind of ownership of like, yes, these are the ways, because I feel like I'm unpacking that shit constantly. Yeah. Like the ways in which I'm that guy, right? There are ways in which I will catch myself and I'll kind of be like, oh, you've done it again.
Well, I mean, people think like woke is a one-time thing, and it's like, no, you need to be constantly reevaluating yourself. I'm constantly fucking up, constantly making mistakes, and other people are too. And as long as you're you know, as long as you're aware of that, and you know, resolve your errors and try to do better, then and think about it. That's what is important, you know. I'm curious, Mira, how you talk to your family.
So it's a different question. It's a different question for the family that I was born into. I married, certainly, but how I talk to my Indian family about this. I mean, the good news is a lot of us are kind of, most of us seem to have kind of coalesced around this and sort of, I think there was a real heartbreak in my family. I think we all hit it at 9/11. So this time we were more prepared for what hate looked like. Like we saw it coming down the pike this time. And I feel like that, I feel like it was a generational kind of like, oh wait, we've seen this before. We know where this goes. So there was, in some ways, it wasn't as complicated as a conversation as it needs to be. But also just to go back to your point about wokeness being a destination, I feel like wokeness is a destination when racism is a plot point, right?
Yeah.
The kind of the logical trajectory.
Yes.
This part of this to kind of unpack. You guys, there are a bunch of questions that people were asking in the other space, and I don't want to. I kind of want to let them ask a couple. So we've got a for time. So I want to, this one was great and it got upvoted. What kind of writing do you hope to see from the Asian American diasporic writers? What do you want there to be more space to push for? Thanks.
You want to go?
I was going to say you could go.
I kind of think it's happening. A lot of the stuff I've seen coming out in the past few years, and I'm talking about fiction in particular, but a lot of like, you know, millennial age Asian Americans just like really getting into the nitty gritty of what that second gen experience is like. I actually just read a book by Alexandra Chang, and the whole middle of it is just about dating white people, like when you're an Asian woman. And I don't know, it just like, it gets into like the messiest versions of that idea. And I'm just like, I'm glad we've arrived at that. You know, like I want us to get out of the place where we have to explain to people that racism is real for Asian Americans. And clearly we're not out of that. You know, Cathy and I were talking the other day about sort of like the spat of Asian American hate crimes and aggressions, you know, toward all of us in light of coronavirus and Trump saying Chinese virus or whatever. But I think Cathy like rightfully pointed out, like it was there before, you know, like it's magnified in some degree now, but like it's always been there. But so I want to get to a point where like, I always think fiction is way ahead of emotionally of where we are. So, you know, I want to see more stories where we don't spend like the first 50 pages explaining or justifying the existence of ourselves and of the things that we deal with.
So absolutely. Cathy, you?
I remember, I forgot who wrote it. I read this tweet and it was by a writer, and maybe someone in the chat forum can tell me who it was. But she said something really hilarious and so on point. And she was like, she was talking about all the anti-Asian racist anti-Asian incidents. And she was like, oh my God, does that mean that I have to write, I have to go back to writing books, trying to prove that I'm a human? All I want to do is write books about dicks. All I want to do is writing a book about sucking dicks.
That was Jean Ho.
Jean Ho, yes.
Yes,
that was Jean. And I just thought that was so hilarious, because I feel that same way. Like we've regressed and we've gone back, and you know, now we have to, I'm like actually writing an article about this, and it's like, oh my God, I have to again prove that Asian Americans face racism. Like how many times, or I have to again write about model minority. I'm so fucking sick of that stereotype. I just want to get on with my life, you know?
Absolutely.
But first of all, I will say that, first of all, I'll say that it's not, I don't think it's all of that racism has been fully confronted. We're going to have to confront it again and again and again. It's like, it's so Sisyphean, but this is just the life of the creative life of being a person of color. And it just comes back every time you think it's over. It comes back, as you were saying, with what happened with South Asians right after 9/11. You know, I mean, maybe there were some South Asians before who thought they were assimilated, and but then, and they were part of the model minority myth, and then 9/11 happened, and they were terrorists, and for East Asians it was the same thing. We were invisible, but we weren't hypervisible. We weren't targets, and then model minority myth just dissolves just like that. And now we have to write about we have to talk about hate crimes. But going back to your original question, I agree with Kevin. Actually, there's a lot of really amazing writing that's coming out now. I want to say, I think there's been a whole renaissance of fiction and poetry happening by people of color. Certainly African Americans, Latinx. I mean, it's been amazing, and I just feel like critics need to be writing about this again and again and again, about this renaissance. But particularly this year and last year, I think there's been a renaissance of Asian American writers. And I can speak for poets like Monica Sok and Franny Choi and Monica Yoon and Banu Kapil, and I mean, there's who's just coming out with a book now, and they write about everything. There's just it's not just about you know, these like kind of sanitized stories about immigrant families. It's like they write about queer, you know, queer identity, about, you know, genocide, and, you know, sci-fi and porn, but they also do it in language that is like totally weird and new and interesting. I love weird, and I'm seeing so much more of that. So, you know, it's happening, and I hope it continues to happen. I know it will happen. Yeah.
So I have a question for you in line with that, and I know we're not going to actually talk too much smack about Chris Jackson, but I know you guys also had him, or maybe we will. No.
Yeah. Kevin, you said it was going to be a roast, right?
Yeah, it's probably worth noting, Regal, we are all published by this publisher, One World, which is published by Chris Jackson, and they're, I don't know, I was just thinking about this like just now, like how many publishers at a major house, there are lots of indies doing this, but like that are focused on like marginalized voices that are actually run by people of color. Very, very, very few. Like
yeah. So I think, do we all work with Victory Matsui and Chris both? Do we all work with it? Okay, so I had a really interesting, I felt like it was wild for me to be edited by editors of color. I felt like the difference for me was palpable in every step of the way. Starting with Cathy, that I just didn't have to explain the kind of level, entry level knowledge. I didn't have to be believed, I was believed, right? That changes everything. When you are writing something and you're writing it to someone that believes you, there's just so many arguments you don't bother with, which then enables you. Like if you think the iceberg, and there's always the part that everyone sees, and then there's the wild underside that just goes on for like miles and miles. I felt like, oh my God, somebody's actually dealing with like the shit that's under the water. Wait, what?
Yeah.
Into that now? Did you guys have that?
Oh my God, yes. I mean, both Chris and Victory. Victory was the one who really edited my book. Chris took over afterwards, and he's been great. He's been so supportive, and I've had many great conversations with him. But in terms of the nitty gritty editing and rewriting, that was all Victory, and it is a huge loss for the publishing world that Victory has decided to join a Buddhist monastery.
I know. I told them we were doing this, so they were like, great.
I know. I was more selfish about it. I was like, but what about me? But I was really happy for them that they chose to go to a Buddhist monastery. But they were just, and I think this is a gift for having any editor who's a writer of color, or someone of color, but especially Victory. They were just tough, you know. They just like pushed me. They were not only encouraging. I mean, they had this very like gentle voice, but you know, I would write something and they would just say, I'm not convinced. You need to push harder, and I need to hear it. Like, I mean, they really edited content, you know. I think there's also the other side for white, I think, with white editors, where they either say, I don't understand it, you need to explain everything, or they could just be a little skittish and be like, since this isn't my subject, I'm just gonna not edit it at all and just make very light mechanical edits, you know. And Victory wasn't like that. They interrogated everything that I wrote, and I think I wrote a better book because of that, you know.
The second thing is what I fear more, to be honest. The second part of that is what I fear more. I fear the editor that tries to give you so much space because they don't feel like they can interact with it in you. Like, they're not going to ask questions, not out of some sort of spite, but really like because you haven't been given a platform before. Here, my job is to give you a platform, but they still with it in the same way. That to me is terrifying, as being kind of, you know, denuded as you go through the process. Like, I feel like both, there's kind of big pitfalls either way.
Yeah.
Kevin, did you have something?
I definitely agree with all of you guys. It's actually interesting. Like, so my full-time job is I'm an editor at a website called The Verge. I used to edit GQ, and it's actually really funny. There's in journalism, there's like increasing and fairly strong in many ways forms of diversity for race among writers, but very few among editors. And it just like is always surprising to me. Like this happens to me a lot where I'll work with someone and then at the end of the process, they'll be like, you're the first editor I've worked that's not white. Like I have gotten that repeatedly. And that kind of thing is sort of, it's like wild to me, right? And like, I don't really see myself as an editor, like being a gatekeeper, but in some ways, like I am. And I don't know, it's interesting because we're at this place where like there is a new strong generation of literature, of novels and of nonfiction by people of color. And yet like we are still so far from penetrating any part of publishing.
Okay.
No.
So this is right. This is, I think this is also true. What do you guys say? Because I know a lot of people that tune into this kind of conversation are writers. They're young Asian American writers who I think a lot about. I'm sure you guys think a lot about too. What can we tell them right now? I know we're going to have to kind of wrap this up, or we're going to get.
Are we wrapping up already? I guess we started really late.
But I know it's going to knock us off. I don't want that to happen either. So, and also the light in my living room is fading, so I'm just going to move to a lighted area.
Okay.
But what do you guys say to young Asian American writers who are kind of coming up and they know that they have something really valid to write about? They know that this experience will resonate with an audience that they can't get to, and they don't know what to do with the kind of the way the industry is stacked right now. What do you tell them?
You want me to go?
Sure. I mean, if you have something to say.
I think when you talk about, I think the work you make, you should just do it the way you want to and think about the audience that you want to speak to. That's obvious stuff. I think it's really important the way you talk about your work. I feel like I am constantly code switching in the way I describe actually the journalism that I edit, but also like my novel. There's a very specific way I describe it to white people. And then there's a way I describe it to non-white people.
Wait, tell me the difference.
Well, it's just actually funny. It is probably too spicy, but like the majority, I should be saying, I'm really thankful that the reviews of my book have been like really positive. But I should have seen this coming, but like in all the major outlets, my book has been reviewed by white reviewers. And they get like a very specific part of the book, which is sort of the workplace tech part of the book. And then it always comes up in one line where just like, Kevin Nguyen like deals with race like very adeptly, and that's it, you know? And then for people of color who read my book, it's like, that's what it's all about. Maybe not all about, but like, it's sort of about how that thing pervades everything, you know? So I'm not gonna say that I'm like frustrated or anything by like that kind of reception. Again, I'm lucky because like it was positive, but it was just interesting reading reviews of my book from extremely smart people who write very well. And I was just like, oh, like they're still not going to get the entirety of this thing. And in some ways, you know, I had a friend who's Filipino, and he was like, huh, your book is just a 300-page litmus test. And I was like, you know, I think that's kind of right. And I that's how I've been sort of describing it to other people of color.
Oh my God. Also, but I feel like, you know, I know what you mean. Like, it's great that it's reviewed positively and the reviews are really interacting with other parts of the book. But I feel like, especially in this audience, we can make room for both. We can make room for the idea that like, yeah, it's great that it got those reviews. And also it's a little bit harrowing, right?
Yeah.
You don't interact with a part of you when that part of you is ignored. Like, it's wonderful on one level to be seen, and then you feel all the parts of you that aren't seen in that same moment. And I think we can just have a space for that. That feels super real to me.
Yeah, just like one more note, it's like I keep doing this terrible thing where I read like my Goodreads reviews. I just need to find a way to like block it from my computer because there are just so many white people just like, well, the race stuff is kind of on the nose. I'm just like, it's not on the nose, man. It's on the whole body, you know?
That is so annoying. I mean, I think what I love about your book, Kevin, is that it's the way you're able to just sort of seamlessly braid technology and race. And I think that's not the kind of the relationship between the two isn't, it's not written about as much, you know? And, you know, even like, you know, I don't know, your book is like a novel of ideas in terms of technology and race. And we think of, a lot of people assume as technology as, yes, evil corporations, but also just neutral. And you just kind of emphasize, it's just there that it's like, it's also white engineers who are making these, building these platforms. And I don't know. I just like, I don't see how you could ignore it at all.
Goodreads will find a way. So
yeah, for my critics, and I've also been blessed with very positive reviews. It's funny because all of my critics have been Asian American women, you know, and so and I feel grateful for that. But it's interesting how your reviewers are white and my reviewers were Asian American. I did get like one kind of shitty review in the Washington Post by this woman, kind of like, she sounded a bit like this like right-wing anti-feminist Caitlin Flanagan. Something very
Caitlin Flanagan read your book?
No, she reminded me of,
oh, okay. I was like, how did I miss that?
She's very uptight, but she was saying something like, oh yeah, like she talks about how Asian Americans need to join up with other allies and, you know, and denounce whiteness. But okay, that's great, but what is Asian American? Tell me what Asian America is. And I'm like, honey, I'm not going to answer that for you. This book is just an invitation, you know? And, but anyway, in terms of advice for Asian American young writers, I would say right now it's your moment. It's, even though the publishing is still mostly white, 80 something percent white, they're listening at least, and what your job is, what you need to do is just like tear the gates open and just like flood through and just don't look back and just and continue writing and encourage. First of all, yes, we need more people of color who are editors and you know, publishers and so forth, and that will definitely help. But I do think it is, at this moment, it could probably change, that it's a much more it's a friendlier environment than it was when I was coming of age in my 20s. And so that being said, I think it's really, you know, I always say this, is to really ignore your critics. That means you're the white audience that we've been bred to please, but also your families and what they'll say about your book. Just, you'll deal with it later. Don't think about that right now. And really write towards what makes you really uncomfortable, which is another way of saying write towards your vulnerability. And I know that seems like a very basic thing to say, but I think that was what was really great about working with Victory, is that even for me, and I've published 3 poetry collections, it was really hard. A lot of times it was really hard to get to that vulnerable point. And I would just mask it with a lot of like critical analysis, and Victory would be like, no, you need to just go deep into that well. And it takes effort. It's hard. It's not like my entire entry.
If your entire survival instinct has been based on avoiding that well, if the entire you've been taught to move through the world is to avoid that specific well, because you know that there's something really crushing about it. Times we've all been going through the middle of our day and been like, oh my God, I'm in the well, I'm in the well, I'm in the well, right? And you have to upright and get upright and present a normal face and walk through like you're not shattered. To have someone else say to you like, no, you got it, like you go there now. And
go back in the well. You need to go back in the well.
Really overwhelming.
Jump in.
It's really, a well is something you fall in and someone needs to rescue you from, but
well, the other,
you have to rescue yourself.
Yeah, exactly. The other thing that I always think of, because one of the things that happened when I was writing my book is the first group of readers I gave it to told me it was a writing group with 4 white writers and then me and another woman of color, and they read it right before the election, and then we met to talk about it right after. And the feedback that I got was, I think one of the actual direct quotes from the feedback was, "This book is why Trump won the election." you are the voice that is dividing America. Like this is the work.
What? Oh my God.
Dividing America. As it can only be split in half.
Amazing. It's amazing.
Mm-hmm.
I had so much power, but you know, I will say it was really devastating to me in the moment because it was an early draft. It was definitely nowhere near where it needed to be, but it also wrecked me to hear that I was the problem, right? Like there was part of that. And what was interesting is that too, you know, there was one white woman in that group, and the woman of color kind of turned to me and they're like, "This is crazy. That I don't know what to say, but you should maybe get out of the group." And I reformed a group of my peers. I found, you know, Alex Chi, and at the time it was Caitlin Greenidge, and I found people that were doing the kind of work that I wanted to do in the world. So I would just say, if you're young and you're listening to this and you don't know what to do with an industry that doesn't have a place for you, or the places are so few for us, find each other,
Yeah.
and write for each other. Teach you a lot. Like that vulnerability, I think that you talk about, Cathy, the reason that you could access that, the reason I could access that is because we're asking me the right questions. And I feel like we can actually do that for each other in a way that's super interesting and really alive. You guys,
I got to snap to that.
I think our time is it might be up here, but I just want to thank you so much for doing this with me. I love your books. I'm so glad they're in the world right now.
Thanks for moderating this, although I feel like it was just a three-way conversation, which is ideal.
Exactly.
Yeah, I love this conversation, Mira. You are just so at ease when you're a moderator. I'm so impressed, you know, like I'm just.
I have a cat on my feet right now. See.
Yeah, there was someone in the chat that just, like, said cat every time they saw him in the background.
I know. I was like, "Where's the cat?"
Well, all right.
All right.
The cat. Good night. Thank you so much.